Last week we left off, the final event that we mentioned was the disaster that became of the northern kingdom of Israel. They were captured by the Assyrians under the leadership of Sennacherib, and they're gone. And like we mentioned last week, it's likely that we'll never see them again, and they're gone from the Jewish people. All we have left is the southern kingdom of Judah, and the southern kingdom of Judah is going to be what is going to comprise the people of Israel. So for those of you who were not there last week, just to kind of where are we in time and history, we're talking about the history of the Jewish people in Israel. And we are right now about between 25 and 2600 years ago. So between 5 and 6, between the 5th and 6th century before the Common Era. And we have, like we said, a major event that preceded that a couple hundred years earlier, where there was a secession, there was a split amongst, in the country. There became two countries, and ironically, the southern kingdom is the one that lasted out of that civil war.
By the way, you can go on the website. What's Janet's website?
PBS.org.
Yeah, PBS.org, and you can see that show. You don't have to have a TV. It's probably up there.
Okay.
What was it?
Seeds of Conflict 1913.
And if y'all haven't seen it,
Yeah.
it was on last Tuesday night. It deals exactly with kind of what we're talking about, except in 1913, and it talks about the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians and all of that living in Jerusalem and all of it coming together, all the beginnings. It's very interesting.
Sounds
I
fascinating.
have a question.
Yes.
You're recording this. Are you going to make this part 1 and part 2 on your?
Yes, it's ready.
Because
Part one's
I
already
left
out.
my folder in the car.
Don't
and I
worry about it.
want
Don't worry about it.
No, you don't have to get it.
Okay, so the southern kingdom is going to outlast them, and we're going to meet a new empire. This time they're called the Babylonian Empire. Right? Babylon is further east, right? Which present-day Iraq is the ancient Babylon. And they are going to march on to Jerusalem, and they're going to destroy Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem was destroyed twice. Jewish people sent into exile twice. It happened not once but twice. Both times, as we now can recognize, both times the Jewish people have come back to Israel. Right? One time we were kicked out of Israel, and we came back 70 years later. And the next time we were kicked out of Israel, we came back 2,000 years later. But either way, when we got kicked out, and it takes us some time, but eventually we'll get back to Israel. And like the Torah foretells, that the Jewish people are going to be kicked out of Israel, and they're going to come back. But the Babylonians come and they destroy. They occupy the known world at the time. This is the theme of the great empires of that time, that they occupy, they capture, they conquer the entire cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, that whole area, including North Africa and parts of Europe as well. But Israel is always at the center of that. We'll see more how Israel is a very disadvantageous locale, because any capturing and any activity, it's right there at the intersection of Europe and Asia and Africa. It's right near the water, and it's always going to be trampled upon by the various conquering empires. So they're captured by Babylonians, and there's a systematic or progressive, or even regressive is probably the right word, dismantling of the Jewish infrastructure. So what happens is that the destruction kind of goes in stages. The first thing that happens is actually 10 years before the temple is actually destroyed. The dates that we have for the temple being destroyed is year 432 before the Common Era. And 10 years before that, so that's 442 before the Common Era, we have a group of 10,000 people that are sent to Babylon in exile. Now, who are these people? The doctors, the lawyers, the rabbis, the scholars, all the elite, all the leadership, so to speak. So essentially, like, as if you pull the leadership away from the people and you replant them in Babylon. Now, in Jewish history, this is presented as one of the great episodes of godly intervention. Now, at the time, the people were, they still had a temple, and they were under foreign control, but they've been under foreign control off and on for some time now. And suddenly, overnight, like all the great people are rounded up and sent out, and you're like, dude, what's left of us? what's left of the community. But the foresight, obviously the Almighty knew what was going to happen, and it was essentially written on the wall what was going to happen. This was not going to last. It was a dying commonwealth that was in Israel. But the vision was to reestablish a very vibrant, very dynamic Jewish community in Babylon. And the best way to do that is to take the great leaders and bring them there earlier, so that when the Jewish people in their entirety, they were all sent into exile to Babylon, they get there, and you know what they find? Jewish schools, right? Bagel shops in every corner, right? Schools and shuls and mikvahs and everything is ready. So there's a vibrant community, and it's there, and it's ready to go. And as we know, the Jewish community in Babylon flourished over the next, essentially till this past century. There was a very strong Jewish community in Babylon. But if you look at the first millennium, so to speak, of the Common Era, for the majority of the time, the dynamic Jewish center was in Babylon. Even when the temple was in Israel, even the Second Temple was 400 years, and the Second Temple was in Israel, there's always going to be a concurrent community in Babylon, where, incidentally, they're going to be recognized politically. They're going to have tremendous stability. They're going to have tremendous institutions that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. We think of Harvard and Yale as these venerable institutions that have been around for 300 or 400 years. There were institutions in Sura and Pumpadisa that were around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, even like 1,000 years or 1,200 years. Like these enormous institutions of Torah study that were in Babylon, that were, it was a wonderful place for the Jewish people to be. And all this would not have happened if the Jewish people were sent in mass to Babylon. So this is an example from Israel, from Israel where they were previously. This is an example, like the Talmud describes it as refuah kodem lamatra, that you get the healing, you get the antidote before you get the illness. The antidote is, the Jewish people, their time in Israel, the illness is the Jewish people's time in Israel is over. However, before that actually happens, before the destruction actually is completed, we're going to prepare the groundwork for the recovery, for the antidote, for the healing, even before that. So this seemed to be a much more seamless transition. And even the destruction wasn't as bad as the destruction that's going to happen 500 years later. It was still terrible, obviously, and it's a day that lives on in infamy. We're going to have in 3 weeks. We're going to commemorate the 9th day of Av, the day, the worst day in the Jewish calendar. It's the day where the spies came back from in biblical times. The Jewish people are crying, we don't want to go into Israel, and that because they were crying for no reason, God says, I'll make you cry for a reason. And that's why all major disasters and catastrophes in Jewish history happened on that day. Even the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943 happened on Yom Kippur. We know that the Spanish Inquisition was signed, on Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'Av, 1943. The Spanish Inquisition of 1482 was signed on Tisha B'Av. Both temples are destroyed on Tisha B'Av. It's a terrible, terrible day where terrible things happen. That's when the temple is destroyed and the Jewish people are sent into exile. That's where we read about, the famous psalm. They're sitting on the rivers of Babylon and they're all dejected. And how did this happen? How did this once mighty and proud nation? We've been in Israel for hundreds and hundreds of years. We had these great kings and David and Saul and Solomon and it spiraled. It was the death spiral, so to speak. It just got worse, and they didn't even notice. People didn't notice at the time. And the prophet Jeremiah tells them, listen, you guys are crying now, but you weren't crying then. You weren't repenting then. Only post facto. Had you repented earlier, had you had this lesson earlier, you wouldn't have had needed to have the lesson foisted upon you. So it's another interesting pattern that we see, that when bad things happen, we remember God. When good things happen, no one says, why does Hashem give me so much money? That's not the question we ask. But when you stub your toe, why does God do this to me? So if you were God and you wanted to have a relationship with a Jew, with your child, so to speak, what would you do? Well, first you try to give him lots of good, and then he doesn't think about you. It's all about his brilliant business mind or his awesome luck or just how fantastic things are. You give him a little stub of the toe, and suddenly you're all part of his life. So if we don't want to have all these toe stubbings, then we do the connection beforehand. That's what Jeremiah told the Jewish people. You're crying now. Suddenly you remember God, and you're evoking all this whole relationship with God. And why did God do this to us? That's what should have happened earlier. And this wouldn't be necessary. And it's an incredible. It's problematic, but it's an incredible idea that essentially we are bound to have a relationship with God. That's going to happen. Now it's our choice. How do we want to have this relationship? Do we want to, in good times, remember God and thank God for everything? Every time you drink a glass of water, you thank God. Every time you eat food, you thank God. Every morning you say Moda'ani, thank God. Right? Is that what we're going to do? Or are we going to wait till things are bad and then suddenly everyone immediately opens up the well springs of faith? That's what happens. And that's what happened to the Jewish people at that time. Now, interestingly, just to contrast, in the 1880s, there were major emigrations to the United States from German and Russian Jews. And in the pre-war, just even up to the 1940s, 1950s, the United States, it was very inhospitable for Jews. Mm-hmm. A lot of Jews came to the United States, and they were Jews, like all Jews in Europe, at least at certain points of Jewish history. And they were good Jews and observant Jews, and it meant a lot to them. But they got there, and there's no shuls, there's no Jewish schools, there's no Jewish food, there's no kosher food, there's no structure in which they could maintain their observance. They had to work on Shabbat, which was a big deal because you didn't show up to work on Shabbat, you were fired. And that kind of infrastructure is very inhospitable for Jewish practice. And what happened? Right? Enormous, thousands upon thousands of families, they just dropped their practice. Not because of any one event, not because they had some sort of theological renaissance or they decided. It was just because there was nothing there. There was no life for an observant Jew in the United States. It's terribly sad, but that's what would have happened in Babylon. Get to Babylon, and you're in a foreign place, and you have to deal with the foreign rules, and that's what would have happened. And the Jewish people are too important to have that happen. So God intervenes. He sends 10,000 of the best and brightest to Babylon. They establish a mini Jewish vibrant community, which grows to a larger vibrant Jewish community. Now, during this time, in the intercession, there's going to be the Purim story. So during these 70 years between the destruction of the first temple and the beginning of the process of rebuilding the second temple, it's only 70 years, which doesn't seem like a lot of time. But in the interim, we see a transition from the Babylonian Empire to the Persian Empire, and that's where we have the whole episode or the whole story of Purim, and that entire story we're all very well familiar with, but that's where it happens. That doesn't happen in Israel. So let's stick to what happens in Israel. So when did the Jewish people come back to Israel? They come back with Ezra. Ezra the scribe. Ezra the scribe is one of the pivotal characters in Jewish history. Now, because in Jewish history, look at certain time shifts, certain shifts in the nature of the nation, and every time there's a major shift, there's a major upheaval, if you will, of Jewish life and Jewish structure, there's always a danger of things going wrong. For example, Ezra, look at Ezra right now as an example, but Ezra, he is going to be the pivotal leader at the time where the very last of the prophets are going to disappear. Right? So he was a prophet. There were still a few other prophets afterwards, but it was waning. Now, a prophet is a tremendous asset for a nation to have. When you have a prophet, you have a direct link with God. And when there's a prophet around, it's very hard for there to be offshoot religions or different groups or any schisms amongst the people. It's very hard to have sectarianism when you have a prophet, because a prophet is undisputed. And it's very hard to have disagreements upon halacha, because you go to the prophet. If prophecy ends, on one hand, well, now all the doors of heresy are opened. So what's going to keep the nation together? What's going to be the leader? Who's going to be the leader? So there's going to be a transition from the prophet being the leader to the Sanhedrin, which is the collection of all the greatest Jewish leaders. They're going to be the focal point of Jewish leadership. But there's going to be also another reality that's going to emerge is the fact that now you have still people living in Babylon. Ezra comes back to Israel. He comes back with 42,000 people. The vast majority, overwhelming majority, a million Jews still stay in Babylon. So now you suddenly have, for the first time in all of Jewish history, you're going to have Jewish communities that are scattered. Some Jews live in Babylon. Some Jews live in Israel. We're going to have a temple. We're going to rebuild the temple eventually in Israel. But there are Jews that are outside of Israel living in Babylon. Another great challenge. So we have the challenge number one of a changing leadership. Number two, loss of prophecy. Number three, different Jewish communities, and who knows how that's going to happen. And number four, in the temple itself, it was lacking. The first temple and second temple were very different. The first temple had all the vessels that are described in the Torah. Second temple was missing some of them, like the Ark of the Covenant, we're all familiar with, but that was not in the second temple. Additionally, the miracles that were ever present in the first temple weren't there. Like the Kohen Gadol would have the Urim Tumim. He would have the breastplate, and then it would light up to answer questions. So like all those things, all these great miracles that were ever present and just there at all times in the first temple were gone in the second temple. There's going to be, over the time period of second temple, there's going to be corruption in the temple itself. Like things that were unheard of, things that were anathema in first temple were okay, where the door was opened. All these little things converge on Ezra. And he's going to be the one who's going to establish what's known as the men of the Great Assembly. This Great Assembly, or the Anshe Knesset HaGdola, which is a temporary expansion of the Sanhedrin, and from 71 members to 120 members. And today's in Israel, the parliament in Israel is called the Knesset, as 120 members, as modeled after the Knesset, the Knesset HaGdola, which means the Great Assembly of Ezra. And they are going to formalize the religion for a post-prophecy era. And they're going to enact, like, what do you do if you're in Babylon and you're so distant from the temple? Well, that was a new reality. You don't have a temple, the tabernacle. Well, what do you do then? And how do you make sure that the people living in Babylon don't forget Israel, don't forget Jerusalem, and don't forget the temple? How do you keep cohesiveness and uniformity in practice when the Jewish people are scattered? All those questions were dealt with, and they formalized our religion. The prayer that we have today is a prayer that was formalized by Ezra. A lot of different areas that they codified and organized. They codified the Bible, right? The 24 words of the Jewish Bible. Who made that canon? Who decided what's in, what's out? Ezra at the helm of the men of the Great Assembly. Bill, you got it.
Yeah. You said when the Jews were kicked out of Israel and went to
Babylon,
but there were still Jews back in Israel.
Well,
so you had two locations of Jews.
Well,
that
for
time.
10 years, for those 10 years.
Yeah,
it's true, but I'm saying, but that wasn't a long-term thing. It was chaos.
Yeah.
The dust hadn't settled yet on that episode.
Okay.
Yeah. You
So
might have
you
had
did have
someone
two,
beforehand who went on vacation to the Bahamas. That doesn't mean that there's like permanent settlements of Jews. Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I meant. Yes.
Okay.
So at that time, did they write the two Talmuds, the Babylonian?
Talmuds are much later.
Much later.
We'll get to the Talmuds hopefully today. I mean, we're not doing a part 3, guys, so we're doing this. We're not doing a part 3. Okay, so let's produce. So that's why Ezra's such a central leader. Obviously, I gave an entire class on Men of the Great Assembly and Ezra and what their roles were and all the different decisions that they made. You go to listen to it, go to RevWob.com and type Ezra or Great Assembly into the search bar, you'll find it. Very, very fascinating time period. And that's why, like we said, Ezra is one of the great heroes in all of Jewish history. We put the Rambam. The Rambam also is a pivotal character. Rabbi Judah the Prince. He also oversees a transition. Ravina Ravashi, the codifiers of the Talmud. They make transformative changes that, with tremendous visionary foresight, that kind of helped us continue and thrive and flourish as a nation. So very important individual, a very important time period. Now, we move on from the Persians as the great dominant nation, and we meet the Greeks. We know that during the I think it's called the Peloponnesian Wars, that Alexander the Great has with the Persians. They're fighting all the time, and eventually he captures everything as far east as India. He captures Israel. He captures everything from Israel all the way to India. The entire Near East is one man. He's incredible. Never lost a battle, Alexander, and he's dead at the age of 32 as well. So he's very young, and Alexander, by the way, is a Jewish name. Everyone knows. If you ever meet a Jewish name, Sender. Why is Alexander a Jewish name? Because Alexander captured Israel, but captured it without any bloodshed. And he had a dream. He used to have dreams about the great Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik, and who was the Kohen Gadol at the time. And when he went to Israel, he actually met him, and he got off his horse, and he bowed down to him. And it was the Jews had a really nice relationship with Alexander, and therefore they said from now on, for the next year, every Jewish boy that's born is going to be called Alexander. And until today, they're ascended like Alexander or Ascender is a Jewish name. Either way, when Alexander dies, his kingdom is divvied up. Why? Because it was such an enormous empire that no one man, no one personality could, control it all. So eventually, it gets split up to three different sections. There's going to be the Ptolemite kingdom or empire of Egypt. There's going to be the Ptolemite Greeks, Assyrian Greeks, and the Macedonian Greeks. Greek proper. Now, we know when the Greeks when they conquered, they didn't just conquer land. It wasn't just about that. The idea of Greek culture, Greek way of thinking, the Greek philosophy was part and parcel of what it means to be captured by the Greeks. So this is an example where it created there wasn't a prophet, and the appeal of the Greeks was overwhelming, and a lot of Jews that were captured were under Greek control. They became what's called as Hellenized. They became influenced by it. So that created an enormous internal conflict amongst the people. You have Jews now that are Jews, but they have, with their little interest. They became influenced. They're Hellenized. They want to go to the gymnasium, and they want to, spend time with Greek philosophy. The whole idea of Greek philosophy, there's no room for God in Greek philosophy. That was a major challenge. But that's a challenge that can only emerge in a society, in a Jewish society, where there's no prophets. If there's any prophets, then any such ideological schism get stamped out. So there's going to be hundreds of years where there's Hellenized Jews and regular Jews and more like traditional observant Jews, and they're going to have conflict. Because the Hellenized Jews will want to bring the Gentiles in, let's open up stadiums everywhere, and let's go around butt naked, like the Greeks do, of course, and the whole idea of humanism and Greek art and all that, philosophy, like they want to introduce that, and those things are anathema to the Jewish people. So that became, like from then on, we're going to meet the Hellenized Jews, and we're going to meet the Sadducees, like, I don't know if we mentioned them last time, but the Sadducees are a group that emerged around the same time, where these are Jews who decide that they don't want to believe in the oral Torah, because they say, well, oral Torah was made up by the rabbis. Now, the only way they can do that if there's no prophets around. When there's prophets around, a prophet is someone who predicts what's going to happen tomorrow, and is always right. No one can argue with the prophet. It's clear to everyone that he has it directly with God. So when the prophets disappear, suddenly everyone who wants to say, "Oh, this part's made up the rabbi, this part's not true," it's free game. So there's a massive group called the Sadducees now. They're going to emerge, and they're going to be a thorn in the side of the rabbis. But the mainstream Jews are going to be influenced now. We have different disagreeing groups, and they're all in Israel. And the Sadducees, a lot of them were priests, and a lot of them were running the temple. And it was a disaster, because you go to the temple, and your Kohen, who's in charge of overseeing your sacrifice, you don't know if he's doing the right thing. You don't know what he's doing. You don't know what he's tampering with. That's a tremendous problem. You have a high priest that says, I'm going to do things my way. I don't want to do it the traditional way. So you see this tension that's going to exist now during this time. Either way, what is happening to the Jewish people with regards to their relationship with the other nations? So we have, like we said, we have the Seleucid or the Syrian Greeks, the Ptolemaic, the Egyptian Greeks, and the Macedonian Greeks, and the Jewish people are originally going to be under the Ptolemies. Alexander dies, I think, in 323 before the Common Era. Eventually, the Ptolemies are in control for the next 120 years over Israel. Because if you actually look at the map, Assyria and Egypt, what's sandwiched right between them? Israel. Mm-hmm. So there's any time that they're warring, right, we're right in the center of it all. So originally we're under the Ptolemies. Eventually, in 198 before the Common Era, we become under the Assyrians, and they're the ones who are going to introduce, let's say, we're going to meet Antiochus III. He's the one who's going to capture Israel. Antiochus IV is his son, who's going to enact the laws against Jewish practice. And it's kind of coming at the Jewish people from all angles, because they have some Jews that are Hellenized, some Jews that are Sadducees, that they're still observant, but not super traditional. That's the challenge from within against religion, and then you have challenge from without. You have the foreign rulers who's now in control of the land. They're the new boss in town, and they say, hey, if you observe Shabbat or observe the laws of Nida, or you circumcise your kid, or you study Torah, we're going to execute you. And they start executing people left, right, and center. Pretty crazy. And then but they have their comrades, so to speak, in the Hellenized Jews, who say, yeah, we're Jews, but we're Greeks. We don't observe any of this nonsense. That's what they said. Now,
in parallel to that, we're all still in Babylonia.
Yeah. So what's interesting at that time?
Happening in Israel.
What's interesting at that time is that the Babylonian Jewry was flourishing.
Isn't that crazy?
Very interesting, because we're going to focus obviously on what happens in Israel.
Yeah.
But throughout this time, there's going to be a vibrant and flourishing Jewish community in Babylon.
And they remain true? They remain true to
yes.
Judaism. You don't have all these...
You don't have that. Exactly. And it seems like Jerusalem and Israel, those are usually hotbeds of on one hand you have fanaticism, on the other hand you have messianism. Something called like the Jerusalem syndrome. People go to Jerusalem, but they decide, well, I'm Messiah. It happens all the time. So you see like these different groups that emerge in Israel. Like people say, and at the time there were other groups like the Essenes. Yeah. The Essenes were a group of Jews who also made their own little cult. But to them, it wasn't about dropping observance. It was about adding more observance. Yeah. So they'll say, oh, let's be abstinent. Let's be celibate. Why don't we try that form of Judaism? And Judaism says, listen, don't add, don't subtract. Don't think that you'll be more religious by saying there's more thing. You add more thing. That's also antithetical to Torah. Torah is Torah. Don't add, don't subtract. Don't say, I'll be even more religious than the rabbi. I'll do things that the Torah says not to do. And they're also gone. All these groups are gone, by the way. We'll talk about how they disappear. But either way, all of these things are going to be ever present in the Second Temple period. Things were fairly good under the Ptolemaic Greeks. In 198, we said the Seleucid or Assyrian Greeks, their control of Israel. Things are okay at the beginning, and then Antiochus IV, he starts this campaign of religious extermination to get rid of the religion, not to get rid of the people, not to kill them, just to pervert their religion. And of course, we know the Hasmoneans, they began a rebellion. And they were successful over a very long period of time of actually gaining autonomy over Israel. Right? They achieved sovereignty from the Ptolemies, from the Seleucids over Israel. We know the whole story, and the menorah, and the oil, and Matisyahu, and Judah, and all that story, the Maccabees. But eventually, they're going to achieve sovereignty over Israel. And they're going to, the Jewish people are going to self-govern for 100 years, and 99 to be precise. From the year 166 to the year 67 before the Common Era. Now, this period, the Hasmonean period, the Hasmonean dynasty, is going to start off very positively. Like we said, Matthias, Matisyahu, and his 5 sons, and these great, they're all Kohanes. Remember that point for a second. They're all Kohanes. And they're all these mighty warriors and great Torah scholars and great leaders, and they fight and they don't care, and they're successful. And the small group is able to outbattle the big group, and the pure beat the impure, and the Tzaddikim beat the Rishaim, and it's all fantastic. We know Judah dies in battle. All the details of the battle, very interesting. I made a video about it if you want to watch it. But all the details of the battle, it's only 8 minutes, the entire story. I did it so fast, it spoke faster than I could even imagine. Regardless, at the end, Shimon, one of the brothers, Shimon was one that's left, and he was the one who became the first Nasi, the first president over this new sovereign Israel. Now, it's very important that he didn't name himself king. Why did he not name himself king? If you remember last week we mentioned, to be a legitimate king over the land of Israel, you have to be a direct descendant of David via Solomon. Therefore, he was a Cohen. Cohen, by definition, is not a direct descendant of David. So he said, I'll be the president. Now, the problem is that this minor sensitivity was lost upon his kids. So he was the president. His kid says, you know what, screw it, I'm king. And over the course of this this Hasmonean dynasty, we're going to meet Hasmonean kings who are Sadducees. That's a pretty big deal. Like, you have the king, who's also a Kohen. He's not supposed to be a king. Sometimes you have kings who are Kohen Gadols and kings. What's the deal with that? And they're in conflict with the majority of the mainstream populace. Yeah, like we said, the Kohen, the elite, are more likely to be Sadducees, but the vast majority of the lay people, they're all traditional observant Jews, the way it always was. And this is tremendous conflict, obviously. And we mentioned last week what happened, like with Alexander Yanai. It's like you read the story. I'm skipping a lot of details, of course, but like you meet like a Kohen Gadol whose name is Jason. Doesn't sound like a name for a high priest, right? It doesn't sound like a Jewish name. Jason, Aristobulus. Is that like a name for a nice Jewish boy? I don't know, man. But Alexander Yanai, he's the king and he's the high priest, and he's taunting the nation and doing things which are against tradition. On the holiday of Sukkot, they all start throwing their eswords at him. We mentioned this last week, but that's a great illustration of what happens when you have this internal conflict, especially between the leadership and the populace. Either way, the epilogue to this dynasty is that the one bright spot at the end of this was the Queen Shlom Tzion. She was a queen, actually. Either way, she was more a wholesome leader, but her two sons are Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. They're fighting over the who's going to be the king, and what do they decide to do? Let's invite the Romans. Let them mediate.
Oh yeah, that was a good idea.
That was their idea at the time. So actually, they invited Pompey, who was, this is obviously the beginning of the great Roman Empire. But Pompey is invited into Israel. Why don't you come and mediate our dispute? And he says, okay, I'll come in. And once the Romans come in, they ain't leaving. So they didn't actually capture Israel in battle. They just settled down. They were invited in. So that marks the end of Jewish sovereignty over Israel, at least till recent times. Well, with the minor exception of Bar Kokhba's revolt in the year 132 to 135, those 3 years. And we know that once the Romans came in, they have their way of doing things, their way of organizing things, the way of setting up local leadership, as well as having proxy leaderships and proctors and proconsuls, and it was very organized, very structured. And they said, listen, you're now Roman subjects, and we don't care if you guys observe the Torah. At least not at that point. That's going to change. You do whatever you want. You have a temple. Just pay taxes and don't revolt and don't rebel against us. And we'll install someone who's like a hybrid Jewish but a Roman, who's going to be in charge, and if everything's good, everything's cool, we're okay. And that's what happened. You have about 100 years before the temple is destroyed where things are okay. The Romans aren't meddling too much. But who's the leader of the people? You have the leader of the people could be a fellow by the name of Herod. Herod, he's a descendant of those Samaritans that we mentioned last time. It's not even clear that he's Jewish, but he's someone who grew up in Rome, and he's friendly with Rome, and he's a nobleman. But he's also kind of quasi-Jewish. We don't know his status. And he comes in and he says, okay, I'm in charge now. And I'm going to do fantastic things like refurbish the temple or build these massive cities, and great builder. That Herod is this great builder on one hand who refurbishes everything, builds all these Caesareas. Every city that builds is called Caesarea. Just builds and builds and builds. Builds Masada, the great fortress of Masada. And on one hand, he's great because he refurbishes the temple. On the other hand, he is the one who is terribly paranoid and executes his own family members and kills 1,000 rabbis and punches out their eyes, and is a terrible, terrible, demon and a villain, and he it's just, what do you do with it, and he executes people left, right, and center. And he was one who executed the last members of the Hasmonean dynasty. It means he's worried. He wants to secure his position, so he says, the royalty that exists with the Hasmoneans, well, what if they want to come back into power? Let's execute them. In fact, he married a Hasmonean, then he executed her. Yeah. It's just a terrible, terrible individual. But that's the kind of leaders that we have. So there's sometimes we don't have leaders, we do have leaders. We have people like Flores, who's going to be in charge, but he's not actually. But he's going to kind of be someone who's going to try to goad the people into rebelling. Really, really bad. Like, we see all these different forces are coming together. Like I said, from internally and externally, we're going to have, like we said, there's the Sadducees, there's the Essenes. We're going to meet these other new groups called like the Sicarium. There's the Biryonim. There's what's called the Pharisees, which is just the rest of the main just people, just the regular standard Jews. We still have the Hellenized Jews. We have the people that are more into Greek culture, more into Roman culture. But all this creates such a mess, and so much internal fighting on one hand and pressure from without, that things are going to get really bad. Things are deteriorate just progressively, not all at once, of course not. But over time, things just get bad to worse. We know in the year 30, even the temple's still around and it was refurbished and it's all beautiful, but the Sanhedrin, which is the leadership of the people, they leave the temple. And why would they voluntarily decide to leave the temple? Why would they leave the temple in the year 30? The answer is because when the Sanhedrin is in session in the temple, only then can all Jewish courts mete out capital punishment. But we know that Jewish courts ought not to mete out capital punishment very often. So in order to force Jewish courts across the globe to stop meting out capital punishment, they decided to voluntarily leave Jerusalem. Once they leave Jerusalem, then the courts anywhere cannot mete out capital punishment. Now, why is that? Because the Jewish system of law and the adjudication of that law is designed for a nation. Sorry, let me take that back. Not the laws, but the actual adjudication of that laws is only designed when these things are very rare. When things deteriorate and there's crime everywhere and there's murders everywhere and things are really bad, well, that's not the Jewish court's job to oversee it. So we see spiritual voids, we see infighting, and all that eventually brought about in the year 66 to the Great Revolt, the first of many revolts that the Jewish people are going to stage against the Romans. And at the beginning, it's successful, but towards the end, the Romans come back and they systematically begin eliminating. Start from the north, on the leadership of Vespasian, and they start systematically going from the north down south, isolating towns. They would isolate a town, they would have a slave siege to the town, they would just choke it, anyone who comes out is executed and crucified. Really bad, and once they break through, they go slaughter everyone. It's disastrous. Man, woman, child doesn't matter. And then when they would leave, they would burn everything down, burn all provisions, kill everyone, put salt to the ground so nothing grows, and just leave decimation. The Romans were okay unless you mess with them. Once you mess with them, they would just systematically eliminate you. And they made their way slowly over 4 years from the north all the way down till they isolate Jerusalem. And there's going to be a protracted siege on Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem, as mentioned last time, Jerusalem is designed, well, not designed, but it's primed for withstanding a siege. Right? There's natural defenses. They always have these massive walls. There's natural defenses. It has a very good water supply. It's self-sustaining in civilization, essentially. All 3 out of 4 sides are surrounded by valleys. So it's very hard to mount a siege surrounding Jerusalem. Either way, we find in the Talmud some great episodes that kind of illustrate kind of window into what was going on at the time. You have so many different groups fighting for a say in the matter. You have the majority of the Jews are still with the Pharisees, with the rabbis, but then you have those ones who say, "Let's go fight them. Let's break through the siege, and let's stand up to the Romans. We could beat them up. We've done it before. We'll do it again. We're not scared of anyone." You have those. You had like a thuggy, like a organized crime unit amongst the Jewish people. Like they were called the Sicarii, like I mentioned. Sicarii is the name of a dagger. They would like assassinate their opponents with daggers. Like that doesn't sound very Jewish, You have obviously the Sadducees, even though their influence is waning. You have the early Judeo-Christians, even though that's really not a thing quite yet. It's going to be a little bigger several decades later. Either way, we find the narrative of the Talmud that there was a storage houses of grain that could have subsisted the people for 21 years. Jerusalem could have had enough resources to last for 21 years. They had wood that would have lasted also for 20 years. And then the people that decided, let's go fight them, they say, hey, the Jewish people, they're very happy. They're self-sustaining. The walls are impenetrable. And they're happy like this. We want to fight the Romans. How do we get to fight the Romans? You know how we do that? Let's burn down the supplies. So they went and they burned down all the supplies. So all the grain's gone, all the wood's gone, and then there's starvation. When you read about what the Torah says about the terrible things that happen to Jewish people, and it says that there's mothers eating their kids, those terrible imagery, well, that actually happened. And it's such a terrible disaster because there was just mass starvation. That's what it was like. Just unimaginable, just tragedy that's happening. And eventually, on the 17th day of Tammuz, which is, by the way, a fast day, since it was enacted as a fast day, and it's actually this upcoming Sunday, the 7th day of Tammuz, the walls were breached. Eventually, the Romans, they got through. People are obviously emaciated. They can't even fight. Every day, between 300 and 500 people try to sneak out to try to find food. And they capture and crucify, which is a terrible, terrible way to die. Because it's a slow process. It takes days and days, and you die basically of blood loss, and you start hallucinating. It's terrible. And eventually, they breach the walls, and a slaughter of epic proportions ensues. So there's 3 weeks, and these are the 3 weeks that we commemorate during the 3 weeks between the breaching of the wall to actually the destroying of the temple, the ultimate of destruction of the great Jewish community that is the destruction of the temple, which is the heart of the Jewish nation, as we all know. That's 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks are weeks that we commemorate with mourning, even till today, because this is the downfall, or one of the great downfalls of our nation. And it's a terrible, terrible disaster. We know just the descriptions, even from secular sources, not just the Roman sources. We know that Josephus, he documents this with great detail. He tells about all the politics and all the individuals and everyone that is a player in this story. But he also details the slaughtering. It's a disaster. And obviously, on the 9th day of Av, the temple is finally lit aflame, and he describes how some Jews decide to jump at the fire, to die with the temple, but the Jews are fighting valiantly, but eventually it's destroyed and there's nothing left, It's just so terrible, so unimaginable. Jerusalem is destroyed, and everything is raided, Jerusalem sacked, and at this time it's no longer Vespasian. Vespasian who began the assault on Judah. He is now installed as the emperor of Rome. His son Titus is the one who finishes the job. So I think in the year 69 was when they changed, when he gave it over to Titus, and he went to Rome. And it's just a disaster. It's so bad that I don't remember who writes this. I think it was Dio Cassius who writes that the slave market was so flooded with Jews that the price of a slave dropped to the price of a horse. So whoever's left alive is just marched to Rome, as a slave. And if you were there at that time and you were trying to prognosticate what's going to be with the Jewish people, you say, well, it's over. It was good while it lasted, but it's over. That's what anyone would say. And we know that we're very resilient, and we rebuild very fast. And I think today, I heard recently that the Jewish people right now are at population levels of pre-Holocaust, which is unimaginable. If you were to look at what was left of the Jewish people, in America there was very, very minimal Jewish framework, and it was all in Europe. And then what do you have left in Europe? You have some just emaciated prisoners in DP camps. That's what was left. It was over. And look at where we are today. The Jewish people came and rebuilt. My highest grandmother just passed away 2 weeks ago, and she was liberated from Bergen-Belsen in 1945. And 2 days after the war, she was liberated with her sister, but her sister got sick and she died 2 days after the war. It's terrible. She died in her arms. Can you imagine? And she contracted TB, tuberculosis, but she made her way to Canada, and she, with her husband, who also was a survivor of the camps, and they built a family. And that's what my wife and my kids are. We rebuilt it. It's only 60, 70 years ago, but we rebuilt from the ashes, and that's what we do. That's what they did after the temple was destroyed.
Do you think if there wasn't a parallel of Babylon, it would have been destroyed?
What do you mean, the Jewish people? Well, Jewish people are destined to always be around. The Torah foretells it. We will be an eternal nation. It's not always going to be fun. It's not always going to be peach and cream. It's not always going to be pretty. We will survive, and we always rebuild it again and again. There's so many disasters that happened to the people even since then. Obviously, right. This is terrible. It's unimaginable what actually happened, and there's more. There's the epilogue. What happened in Masada, we know, in the year 73. That was the final death blow. But what happened in Beitar in 136 was even worse. But we constantly rebuild. That's the hallmark of the Jewish nation. But why does it happen? It happened because we brought it onto ourselves. And the Torah even tells us, you choose. Do you want everything? You could have everything. You could be in Israel. You could have material success and prosperity and health and happiness, and you can have spiritual success and happiness, and you can have it all. You start fighting with each other. You start neglecting God. You start inventing these other new offshoots of your religion. You start having ideological schisms. This is what's going to happen. And you know what happened? What was the grand result of that? Where are the Sadducees? Sadducees disappeared. Right? Where are the Essenes? They're gone. Where's these Biryonim and Sikarim? All these different groups, they're gone. Right? All you have left is what we started off with. We bring these things onto ourselves via our decisions. It's pretty remarkable. The Torah spells it out. It's not like it should be a surprise to anyone. That's what it says. We talked about it. Israel says, I will, the verse we mentioned last week, Israel says, I will vomit the Jewish people out of Israel if they behave like the Gentiles. I'll vomit them out. And they did multiple times. The Jewish people were vomited out. It was a disaster. That's unimaginable. But the lesson is very, very powerful for us. Either way, by the time we begin the second century of the Common Era, 110, 115, there's going to be a tremendous effort to rebuild. In the 70s, not the 1970s, but the 70s and 80s and 90s, there's going to be titanic efforts to rebuild the Jewish people, especially under the leadership of the Sanhedrin. It's now in Yavne. Herculean efforts are made to rebuild the people. And by the time 50, 60 years later the Jewish people are back. They're at full strength, which is just remarkable.
Living where?
Oh, well, like we said, there's still a Jewish community in Israel, in Jerusalem even, but even northern Israel at the time was much more a center of Jewish life. Of course, the Babylon has been uninterrupted almost at the time. Either way, we're going to meet a new Roman emperor who's going to do things that are, maybe the worst villain outside of Haman and Pharaoh and Hitler and I guess Ferdinand and Antiochus. If you were to make I don't know what you would call a Mount Rushmore, or the opposite of Mount Rushmore of Jewish villains. You meet a fellow by the name of Hadrian. Hadrian assumes emperorship in the year 117, and he eventually, not immediately, but he decides to once again try to systematically dismantle Jewish people. And he does a lot of things that are very similar to Antiochus. He makes restrictions against public Torah study. He makes restrictions against circumcision as well, which is always It's always a lightning rod of disdain from the Gentiles. And he says, like, he used to teach Torah publicly, we'll execute you. So we know that Rabbi Akiva was executed because he taught Torah publicly. And how was he executed? In a terrible way. He had his skin flayed off of him. Just unimaginable.
That was under Hadrian.
That's under Hadrian, that's right.
I didn't realize that.
That was actually after the Bar Kokhba revolt. But that's an example. Like, and he's, for example, he said one of the things that he did, one of the things that he banned was conferring of smicha. That to us, that doesn't make any. What does it even mean? What does smicha mean? So smicha means rabbinic ordination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the smicha that existed at that time was an uninterrupted smicha from Moses to his students, to his student, to his student, to you. If you had smicha, it means you receive from someone, receive from someone, receive from someone, receive from Moses. And to be as part of Sanhedrin, you had to have smicha. So Hadrian figured, if I want to dismantle the Jewish religion, I'll dismantle religion. The leadership had to do that by saying you cannot give smicha. And once you cannot give smicha, well, then you can't have anyone be part of the Sanhedrin. So he says, if someone gives smicha, I'm going to kill the guy who gives smicha. I'm going to kill the guy who receives smicha. And I'm going to exterminate the entire town in which the smicha was conferred. That's what he says. So this great Jewish hero, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, he takes 5 students, and he goes exactly equidistant between 2 cities, and stealthily gives them smicha. And then the Romans were following them, and he tells his people, run away! They're after us! Those 5 students manage to escape, but they take the rabbi and they puncture him, the Talmud says, with 300 spears. Now, is it an exact number? We don't know. But they puncture him like a sieve, like a sifter. They just puncture holes in him. Terrible. Like that. That's what happened under Hadrian. And those conditions were so bad that obviously the Jewish people said, "Die, enough." And there was a revolt, and this is one of the greatest revolts in all of Roman history, Roman Empire history. That's the Bar Kokhba revolt. Obviously, this is an entire, like, we're going through these things really quickly, but Bar Kokhba is the one who leads the rebellion that is successful, at least temporarily, to get rid of Romans from Israel. Get rid of them, they're gone. And he becomes the king, King Bar Kokhba, everything's great. Rabbi Akiva is so excited, he says, this guy's Messiah. Eventually things go south, and Hadrian regroups, and they quelch the rebellion. And it's really, really, really bad. You want to read about what happened in Beitar, the extermination of Beitar. By the way, what day of the year did that happen? In 136? The 9th of Av. Beitar was the last stronghold of the rebellion, and when they finally succeeded in overcoming, they had a slaughter of unimagined proportions. Like the Jewish sources and the Roman sources both pegged the number at hundreds of thousands of people. The Talmud says there was so much blood everywhere that the Gentile farmers didn't need to fertilize their fields for 7 years. Like that's what it says. And it says a number like 900,000 people were slaughtered. Just unimaginable. But either way, and the systematic dismantling of the religion was attempted, but thankfully, thank God, the grace of God, Hadrian died, and his attacks went with him. And either way, this became clear to everyone who was there at the time that this is an untenable situation. Like, things are just getting so bad and so worse, and you thought it was better, but it got worse. And at risk was the fact that if things continue, you can't teach Torah publicly, you can't become a rabbi, you can't have relations, right? If those things continue, there's going to be the risk that something even worse than all this is going to happen. And that is that the Jewish people are going to forget the Torah. That the oral tradition of rabbi to student, all the way it's been since Moses, the great yeshivas where these things, where this teachings happened, those are going to be dismantled, and then it's all is lost. And this is once again another time where there's a pivotal point in history where one man essentially makes decisions that are so visionary at the time, but essentially saves the Jewish people. Just like Ezra at his time, Rabbi Judah the Prince is the one who decides to codify the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is a writing down of the oral Torah. We have the Mishnah today. I have an entire set of Mishnah in my house. Every Talmud is based upon the Mishnah. But that decision of writing down all of Jewish law, taking 1,000 rabbis and spending 20 years of editing the Mishnah, that is a decision that now we can see made Torah and thus Judaism transportable. Thus, in exile, when there's going to be a scattering, and everyone's going to leave Israel, and then the Sanhedrin is going to be disbanded, and there's going to be no central leadership, and there's going to be people that are going to be on their own. Right? Smaller communities, all isolated. What's going to keep Jewish? What's going to keep Jewish practice alive? The Mishnah. Writing down of everything of Jewish law. Everything. Right? Just an enormous undertaking. 63 books. Think about that. Of codifying every single word of Jewish law. A tremendous choice is Rabbi Judah the Prince, or Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, or just Rabbi Yehuda. In Jewish writings, he's oftentimes just called rabbi. You say, rabbi? Well, which rabbi is he?
Yeah, the rabbi.
He's the rabbi because his position as a leader of the Jewish people is unmatched by anyone, and he's just called rabbi because he's just the rabbi of who? Of everyone. Just remarkable. That happens at the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era, but either way, the Jewish people are already not living in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is bereft of Jews. Hadrian, by the way, when he squelched the rebellion, few things that he did was he raised Temple Mount. He renamed Jerusalem, Eli Capitolina. He renamed Israel, Philistia. He renamed, like I mentioned this last week, he renamed Shechem, Nablus. Right, not Nablus, Neapolis, but which became Nablus. Either way, there is going to begin the process of petering out of Jewish life in Israel. It's not going to happen overnight, of course, but at that time it became evident that the growth and the vibrancy is going to be in Babylon and elsewhere in North Africa and in Europe, not in Israel. And of course, this takes a while, but after a couple hundred years, if you were to go to Israel, you'll see that it's very scantily populated with Jews, and it essentially becomes overgrown with nothing. And even though Israel is no longer at the center of Jewish life, it always was and always will be at the center of Jewish consciousness. Jewish prayer, we pray for the restoring of the Davidic kingdom, restoring of Israel, and all that. But for the next, essentially, till like the 1900s, there's not going to be a major effort, a global effort of reinstituting Jewish settlement in Israel. There's going to be efforts in the 12th century, going to be some efforts, and there's some successful efforts in the 15th century. The 12th century was to Jerusalem, and 15th century was to northern Israel, primarily to Tzfat. In the 19th century, in the 18th century, is going to be a major effort to move to Israel. But either way, until the 19th century, there's not going to be a global effort. Where the Jews are everywhere. They're in Spain, of course. They're in Babylon. All attempts were aborted. It's just, we think you should get on a plane and go to Israel. Like, to go to Israel at the time meant you had to undergo a very treacherous journey, and to go there is barren. What are you going to do there? Even if you got there, you're on your own. Like, it's just overgrown. There's nothing going on there. That was basically what was going on in Israel. Nothing, So there were some efforts and some successful, but even successful, they were very, very small scale. As we know, Zionism is not a new idea. It's part of the prayers, restoration of Zion. We say those words. But either way, Zionism is the modern effort, political and even religious efforts, to get Jewish people back to Israel. Obviously, we know it's successful. The details, it could be an entire class. I want to finish the entire thing. But either way, Herzl is another example of a great Jewish leader who doesn't seem to have any business being a Jewish leader. Like we said, he didn't circumcise his kids. His son Hans, he didn't circumcise him. He gave him bar mitzvah. He didn't speak Hebrew. He knew nothing about Jewish life, and Jewish philosophy, and Jewish culture. Well, culture probably he did, but he didn't know much about Jewish law. Nothing. Like, he was an example of a Jew that was entirely assimilated. But something awoken within him, and he just, he left no expense to try to restore Israel. It's remarkable. Another example of that.
He started Zionism.
I'm sorry?
He started Zionism.
Well, Zionism is his idea, but modern political Zionism is his, almost single-handedly he started it. He got political support, and he met with world leaders, and he made 1897 the Zionist Congress, the first Zionist Congress, second Zionist Congress, and he went and he kind of was the leader of a very diverse group of Jews. You had the religious Jews that were thinking about Messiah and going back to Israel in a spiritual way. You had the more assimilated Jews who said, well, it's just not a good place for us to live in Europe because things are so bad and so much anti-Semitism. Let's go build a modern state of Jews. It doesn't have to be in Israel. It could be in Africa. It could be anywhere. It wasn't anything about restoring Zion like that. So those two groups came together, and eventually, as we all know, we're back in Israel now. 1948, May 14th, state of Israel was declared. We had some major wars. Obviously, the War of Independence of 1948, 1949, the Sinai campaign of 1956. In 1967, everyone was sure that Israel was going to be destroyed. All foreigners left. They dug 10,000 graves in public parks in anticipation of the great slaughter that was going to happen. And as we know, this was a lightning campaign that the Jewish nation, the Jewish army undertook, and they succeeded in destroying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Egyptian warplanes, and they won. And then they destroyed all the Syrian warplanes, and then they had complete dominance, and they just, they captured the old city, of course. They got the entire Sinai. They got the Golan. They expanded their territory by a factor of like 2 or 3, enormous. And things are good. Things are progressing. I would say that spiritually, we would say that this seems to be in line with what the messianic predictions of the Torah. Jewish people come back to Israel. Well, we're back in Israel. We're not entirely back in Israel. We started off the state of Israel with 600,000. Now there's 6 million Jews in Israel. So it's grown by a factor of 10 in less than 70 years, which is remarkable. But things are, I think, in my estimation, moving closer and closer to the ideal. Is it perfect? No. Israel is going to be the Jewish state, but not just the Jewish state, like any other state. It's to be the Jewish state the way it's designed to be. But I feel like the direction or the trend is trending more and more towards closer and closer to the way it eventually will be. There's a bill in the Knesset right now, which is labeling Israel as a Jewish state and getting rid of Arabic as an official language, to declare that Israeli law is going to be modeled after Jewish law, halacha. We know that in Israel there's many indicators that it's getting closer and closer to what it ultimately will be, and that is the Israel that's designed, for the Jewish people living in a certain spiritual reality and in a way that is not going to cause, via their activities, via their actions, via their behavior, to have the land vomit them out. We don't want to go through that again. It's not pleasant. But I think that the trend is moving in the right direction. I think that in direct opposition to the hallmarks or the indicators that contributed to the downfall of Israel multiple times, the civil war that led to the 2 different kingdoms, or the just mess that contributed to the destruction of the Second Temple. Those things, I feel like the trend is happening in the opposite direction, where there's more and more of a unification of the people of Israel and the Jewish people at large. And I think that that's a very, very positive towards earning, so to speak, with our behavior collectively, the right to say that we actually deserve to be the land of Israel, and we're doing it the way it's been foretold that it will happen, and the way we're guaranteed to actually be there and not be kicked out. That wasn't pleasant. We don't want to go through that again. So that's that. We kind of went a little quickly towards the end of Zionism and all that, but that's basically it. It's, of course, this could be broken down into many, many more little, of course, but that's big picture. It's kind of important to know not just the details, but also the forest, so to speak. Is there a question there?
No, I was just going to say, though, that show on PBS that we're talking about, it starts out showing this film that they thought was lost, that shows the Jews coming to Israel, leaving Europe, and because of the anti-Semitism, and actually coming into Israel to form it.
Wow.
I mean, it's really a good...
Well, it shows the successes.
Yes.
And they really were, in this film, it was basically kind of a propaganda film for Jews to show how well the Jews had done, when actually there was a lot that wasn't so great.
But in their position,
And
we
it
would
has
probably do the
Her-
same
and
thing.
It has, and
Well,
has
apparently-
Herzl and Basel and all of that. That's all
Wow.
in there.
Fascinating.
Mhm.
That's that, guys. Our history is fascinating, and
Mhm.
God
Sure
willing, we're going to
is.
have a more detailed treatment of history
But
sometime.
I'm sure it's available
next-
online.
Yes. Okay, everyone. I have another meeting at 9, so I'm going to rush out of here. I wish you guys.